and within minutes it began spreading like wildfire. This wasn't just any interview. It was the first time Jonathan had agreed to sit down and talk openly after his father's passing, a moment the public had been waiting for. People across the country knew that the Lamb family's name was tied to one of the biggest Christian media empires in the world, and whispers about a billion-dollar inheritance had been circulating for months. Now, finally, Jonathan was about to address the rumors head-on. The interview setting was calm, but filled with unspoken tension. The air seemed heavy, almost as if everyone in the room knew that something big was about to be revealed. Jonathan walked in quietly, dressed simply, his expression serious but controlled. There was no trace of showmanship, no attempt to charm the audience. Instead, his demeanor carried the weight of a man who had lived through long weeks of grief, decisions, and sleepless nights. As the camera started rolling, the interviewer welcomed him warmly, but with a subtle hint of curiosity in her voice. Everyone watching, both in the studio and at home, was hoping for answers. Jonathan had been silent for so long that his decision to speak now felt deliberate, almost strategic. This wasn't going to be small talk. This was going to be themament where truths would come to light and perhaps where hearts would be moved. In living rooms, offices, and even church halls, people tuned in. Some were longtime supporters of the ministry, praying he would protect his father's legacy. Others were critics waiting for confirmation of the rumors they had heard. And a few were simply curious, wondering how a man could handle the responsibility of inheriting something so massive and so public. Jonathan took a deep breath, his eyes focused. He looked like a man who had rehearsed his words, but also someone who knew that no amount of preparation could truly soften what was coming next. The stage was set, the questions were ready, and the world was about to hear his side of the story for the very first time. The night before the interview, Jonathan barely slept. His mind kept replaying moments from the past year, the hospital visits, the final conversation with his father, the funeral that felt like a blur. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, smiling yet serious, Asif giving him one last piece of advice. He had known this day would come, but knowing and being ready were two very different things. That morning, he sat alone in his study, the same room where his father had once prepared for countless sermons and meetings. The walls were lined with books about faith, leadership, and vision, each one a reminder of the mission that had built the family's life. Jonathan stared at the desk in front of him, running his fingers over its smooth surface, remembering how his father used to sit there, pen in hand, sketching out plans for the future. His thoughts kept returning to the weight of responsibility now on his shoulders. People saw the billion-dollar figure and imagined luxury, power, and influence. But Jonathan knew the reality was far more complicated. Behind the impressive numbers were hundreds of staff members who depended on the ministry for their livelihood, countless projects that needed funding, and communities that looked to them for hope. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a test of character. Emotionally, he was torn. Part of him wished he could simply grieve in private, away from the cameras and expectations. Another part knew that silence would only fuel speculation and division within the family and the ministry. The pressure from the media had been relentless, and whispers from within the family had been even harder to bear. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on what he should do. But at the end of the day, the decision and the consequences would be his alone. As Thekar arrived to take him to the interview, Jonathan took a deep breath and whispered a short prayer. He asked for wisdom, courage, and the strength to speak the truth, no matter how it might be received. Deep down, he knew that what he was about to share would surprise many and unsettle others. But there was no turning back now. It was time to step into the spotlight and carry both his father's legacy and his own truth into the public eye. The interview began smoothly with a few gentle questions about Jonathan's memories of his father and the early days of the ministry. He answered them with warmth, though his voice occasionally carried the strain of someone still navigating grief. But the calm didn't last long. After a short pause, the host leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing in focus. "Jonathan," she began, her tone careful but firm. "There's something everyone has been wondering. Reports have been circulating about $1 billion. For a moment, the entire atmosphere in the studio shifted. The crew members, thought trained to remain expressionless, seemed to hold their breath. Jonathan didn't rush to answer. Instead, he lowered his gaze briefly as if weighing every word he was about to say. His hands rested calmly on his lap, but his stillness hinted at the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. He knew this was the question the world had been waiting for. It wasn't just about money. It was about influence, power, and the future of everything his father had built. The question carried layers, financial, spiritual, and deeply personal. Any answer he gave would be dissected by journalists, analyzed by supporters, and criticized by those who had never trusted him. Finally, Jonathan lifted his head and looked directly at the host. "It's true," he said quietly, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that made the room feel even smaller. "But it's not what people think." The host tilted her head, sensing there was more. "What do you mean?" she asked. Jonathan hesitated, glancing briefly toward the studio lights. People hear billion-dollar inheritance, and they imagine endless resources, luxury, freedom. But what I inherited wasn't just wealth. It came with responsibilities, commitments, and truths that most people don't know. There was a murmur among a few people off camera. The host pressed further. "Are you saying the inheritance has conditions?" Jonathan gave a small nod. "Yes, and those conditions will change everything." The room fell silent again. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing they were about to hear something far more complicated than just a story about money. Jonathan took another deep breath as if the words he was about to speak had been locked inside him for months. The audience, both in the studio and at home, could sense the weight of the moment. He leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but carrying a sharp edge of truth. "What people don't realize," he began, "is that this inheritance is not just about money. It's a legacy and a burden. My father built Daystar with his faith, his vision, and his relentless work. But what the public never saw were the sacrifices behind the scenes." He paused, his eyes momentarily clouding with emotion. "There were years when the ministry was drowning in debt. Years when my parents went without paychecks to keep broadcasts on the air. Then Umbers might look glamorous now, but behind them are unpaid loans, legal disputes, and promises my father made to people who trusted him." The host's eyebrows rose slightly. "So, you're saying this billion-dollar inheritance isn't exactly what it seems?" Jonathan gave a faint, almost tired smile. "Exactly. It's not a vault filled with gold. It's hundreds of ongoing projects that need funding. Thousands of supporters who expect us to keep moving forward, and there are things in the paperwork that I never knew about until recently." He hesitated, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then he continued, "There's a part of this story that only a few in my family know. My father left behind a responsibility that is far greater than the money itself. A responsibility to fulfill promises that in some cases could take decades to complete. It's a commitment to causes that were dear to him, causes he never publicly spoke about." The host leaned in. "Can you share an example?" Jonathan's voice grew softer. "Some of it involves communities overseas where he built churches and funded schools in secret. There are agreements with people who never wanted recognition, just faithfulness to the work. Those are written into the inheritance. I can't ignore them, and I won't." For the first time in the interview, the audience wasn't just curious. They were moved. This was no longer a story about a wealthy man inheriting a fortune. It was about a son stepping into his father's shadow, discovering truths that changed everything, and deciding whether to carry a weight he never asked for. Jonathan's voice grew quieter as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. It was as if he was choosing his words with surgical precision, aware that what it was about to reveal would change. The way people saw his father and him forever. "When I finally sat down with the lawyers to go through my father's will," he began, "I expected it to be straightforward. I knew there would be instructions about the ministry, about the properties, about how the funds should be managed. But there was something I didn't expect, something hidden in the middle of those legal pages that caught me completely off guard. He paused, recalling Themament vividly. It was a clause written in my father's own words, and it wasn't about dividing assets or transferring ownership. It was a condition. Jonathan exhaled slowly. The clause said that I could only fully receive and control the inheritance if I made a binding commitment to continue my father's work exactly as he envisioned it. Not for a few years, not until it was convenient, but for the rest of my life. I wasn't allowed to sell the network. I wasn't allowed to walk away from the ministry, and if I failed, everything would automatically transfer to another person. My father had named someone outside of the family. The audience murmured softly, shocked by the idea. Jonathan continued. My father wrote that clause because he believed this was more than a business. To him, it was a calling, and he wanted to be sure that whoever took over wasn't just chasing the wealth, but carrying the mission. He looked down for a moment, his voice thickening with emotion. I realized then that my father wasn't just leaving me money or property. He was leaving me a lifelong promise to keep. It wasn't just about managing an empire. It was about living every single day in service to something bigger than myself. The weight of that clause had changed everything for Jonathan. It wasn't just an inheritance anymore. It was a test, a trust, and a challenge that could either define him or break him. Jonathan sat silently for a moment, as if replaying the exact day he made his choice. His fingers intertwined, his expression steady but filled with a quiet intensity. When I read that clause, he began slowly. I knew I had two options. I could walk away, forfeit everything, and let someone else take the reins, or I could accept the responsibility, knowing it would change the course of my entire life. He looked at the host, his voice deepening. I chose to accept it, but not in the way people expected. The host tilted her head. Curiosity etched across her face. What do you mean by that? Jonathan took a measured breath. Most people assumed that if I accepted, I would keep the inheritance for my own benefit, maintain the lifestyle, keep the luxury. But I decided that if I was going to honor my father's vision, then the resources shouldn't just sit in a vault or in investments. They should be working for people. So I committed housing a significant portion of it to fund community projects, expand outreach programs, and help those my father cared for most, even in places far from the spotlight. The room was silent. Jonathan continued. This wasn't about making the ministry bigger just for the sake of it. It was about making it deeper, reaching the people my father always dreamed of, helping that never had enough time or sources to reach. A faint smile crossed his face, though it was tinged with emotion. I knew it would shock people. Some in the family weren't happy. They saw it as giving away what could have been kept. But to me, holding on to that money without using it for good would have been the same as breaking my father's promise. He leaned forward slightly, his tone unwavering. So I made my decision public. I told the board, the staff, and eventually the world, the inheritance will not be my personal empire. It will be a mission. Every dollar will be used with purpose, and every decision will be measured against the question my father lived by. Does this serve God's people? For a long moment, there was no sound, just the weight of his words settling in. Then, slowly, a wave of applause filled the studio. Not everyone agreed with his choice, but no one could deny the conviction behind it. The announcement spread faster than Jonathan could have imagined. Within hours of the interview airing, clips of his words were being shared on social media, news websites, and television broadcasts across the country. Some headlines praised him. Jonathan Lamb turns billion-dollar inheritance into global mission and legacy of faith over fortune. Others took a more skeptical tone. Is Jonathan giving away too much? And family rift over inheritance decision. On social media, the reactions were mixed but passionate. Supporters flooded the comments with messages of admiration, calling him a man of integrity and a worthy successor to his father's vision. Church groups shared the interview during services, pointing to Jonathan's decision as an example of truest stewardship. Some even said it renewed their